She was found with a paperclip in her hair and a name she didn't yet remember. For 22 years, Duluth had been a map of absence, a family erased from picnic photos, a plane emptied from the manifest, a question that never stopped asking itself. Then one morning in 2014, a woman, who would later say her name was Hailey Turner, walked into a hospital emergency room in a coastal town she couldn't place. Her eyes carried a cut of winter light and a single impossible fact: she was alive. What followed would become the Minnesota 1992 cold case solved. But the truth that came out of it was messier, meaner, and farther reaching than anyone in that town could have imagined. Before we dive deeper, take a second to subscribe to Calis-Crime Vault and smash the like button. It's much appreciated. And keep these stories coming your way. Drop your state in the comments below and let me know where you're watching from. The Turners left Duluth on a bright September afternoon in 1992. Mark Turner had taken his Cessna 172 for what was meant to be a quick family trip, to clear his head, to celebrate Lisa's birthday, to give the girls a thrill. He worked at the port, calculated time frames the way some people count breaths. Lisa smiled and packed sandwiches. Hailey, 12 then, and Emily, 7, giggled with the small, fierce certainty of children who trust their parents without reservation. They waved at neighbors. They stepped into the plane with the same ordinary faith people carry across their days. The plane never returned. A white blip vanished from radar over Lake Superior, and overnight, a police box of assumptions formed. Pilot error, sudden storm, mechanical failure. The Coast Guard ran sweeps with helicopters and nets. Divers combed currents and searched for wreckage that never came up. The little town of Duluth gathered at the edge of the harbor like an extended family grieving one of its own. Memorials were held on the pier. Candles floated like tiny promises. The Turner's house stayed exactly how Lisa had left it. A photograph on the mantel, a stack of unread postcards, a swing in the backyard stopped mid-arc. People left notes that turned into weeds. The search tapered. The missing file thickened on the investigator's shelf and then moved to cold case archives. For 22 years, the questions multiplied like shadows. There were theories: a mid-air fire, a navigational mistake, a swoop into the fog. Some suggested the plane had been stolen and the family killed ashore. Others whispered about secrets the Turners might have had, or enemies, or debts. Conspiracy forums turned the lack of wreckage into proof of conspiracy. Late-night cable shows patched the case from old footage and intensity. Rumors, as rumors do, built themselves into stories. A man seen near the airport fighting with Mark. A woman who said she had seen the plane circle once and then dip low over the waves. None of those leads came close to the truth. When Hailey walked into that ER in 2014, she was 28. Her hair was cut short. Her hands were small, and the skin on them bore the pale geography of a life lived with discipline. She did not say she had been kidnapped or held. She said she had a name, and then she said, "Where's my family?" She said it the way someone asks about a child at home, with the deep ache of an ache that has matured and learned to store itself. The ER nurse practiced in the arithmetic of trauma, called the police. The news should have washed over Duluth like a tidal wave. Instead, it started as a whisper, then a phone call, then a plane ticket. Detective Sam Ortiz was the first investigator to take the case after Hailey was identified. He had been a young patrol officer in 1992 and remembered the empty swing in the Turner's yard. Now, 2 decades later, he held the kind of tired vigilance that older detectives carry like armor. He flew to the hospital and watched Hailey as if the manner of her breathing might reveal something. She answered questions slowly, rarely. Her memory of the day of the disappearance arrived in jagged glints: the engine cough, the feel of her father's hand, the crash of white light. But she had blanks. The wide, blank seams in her recollection where decades had eaten scenes. She could not recall the exact place where the plane went down. She could not recall how the four of them shifted from being a family to being separated. Over the coming months, what Hailey could remember and what investigators could learn braided into a single fragile rope. Hailey remembered a man's laugh and the smell of motor oil. She remembered being taken off the plane by people who wore no uniforms, but spoke as if they belonged somewhere official. She remembered being told to stop asking questions. She remembered a name from time to time, a single syllable that collected in her mouth like a stone. She remembered being moved and then moved again from place to place. She remembered in pieces, foods, and songs, and the blurred geography of rooms. Those fragments were the opposite of answers, and yet they were enough to reopen the file. New detectives resurrected old records, pilot logs, maintenance certificates, fuel receipts. They re-interviewed witnesses who had been too young in 1992 to be sure of what they'd seen. They poured the old case through modern lenses, cell phone towers, credit card trails, social media breadcrumbs that had become pathways only in the 21st century. The Coast Guard revisited oceanographic models to reconsider currents. The cold case unit fed new evidence into DNA databases that did not exist in 1992. And then, slowly, the outlines of a person began to form. His name, when it came, was Daniel Mercer, a private pilot who had taught at a local flying club and had a reputation for a too-bright smile. He had been friendly with Mark Turner. Everyone in the hangar knew him. In 1992, he was a fixture in Duluth's small aviation circles. A man who could charm a community and command cockpit. On paper, he was clean. No arrests, no complaints of violence. But investigative work is often an exercise in looking at the negative spaces. It is the silence around a person that sometimes tells you more than his alibi. Mercer's logbooks, which had once been declared lost in a boating accident, were located in a storage locker. They contained a single entry. A cross-country flight logged the day after the Turner disappearance, with an odd note in the margins, returned early, baggage left. Scrawled in a hand that Detective Ortiz said made his teeth ache. Confronted with the new scrutiny, Mercer did not seem like a man who feared exposure. He gave interviews through a lawyer and denied involvement. "I love that family," he said, with a kind of measured sorrow practiced by men who have not been put to the test of full truth. He insisted he had been flying elsewhere the day of the disappearance. His alibi was for a time persuasive. It had been corroborated by friends who later admitted their memories had softened to help him. Investigators kept pulling at the thread. The legal engine of any cold case depends on evidence that a court will accept. Fingerprints from the plane had been inconclusive. The radar blips were ambiguous. But a different kind of evidence, a testimony, emerged from a place no one had expected. A woman named Marlene Whitcomb, who had once dated Mercer in the late 80s. Marlene contacted the Duluth police anonymously, and then when detectives secured her cooperation, she came forward in person. She was small and quick. Years had carved a certain steel into her voice. Marlene told a story that filled a gap investigators had only known was there. She said that in the weeks before the flight, Mercer had been restless, his voice full of a contempt that had been new. He had hinted at a plan to leave town and had made references to someone taking care of a problem. He laughed once about making something disappear, Marlene said, eyes fixed on the table. And it wasn't the kind of joke you make at a party. She did not know the details, she warned. She claimed she had left Mercer because of his temper. Her testimony alone could not convict a man of murder. It was a piece, but a meaningful one. It moved Mercer from suspicion to focus. Then came the most unnerving confession of all, the one that arrived like a confession should not, from a man who claimed he had helped. His name was Alan Price, a mechanic who worked at the same small boundary hangar as Mark Turner. Alan had a past, petty theft, a name that cropped up on the margins of small-town gossip. He showed up at the detective's office at dusk and said he had kept a secret for 20 years because I was scared, and scared men don't do brave things. Alan's story was neither cinematic nor neat. He said that on the day of the Turner's flight, he had seen the Cessna taxi and lift. And then he had seen Daniel Mercer on the ramp speaking with a group of men Alan did not know. He had watched the plane for a long while, until it disappeared in the distance. Weeks later, Mercer had asked Alan to help move something from the shoreline hangar to a boat. Alan, who was young, frightened, and out of work, agreed. He said the cargo was heavy and wrapped in tarps. He remembered the sound of a child's laugh echoing from within the cloth for reasons that made him sick to his stomach. He said he had helped load the cargo onto a vessel headed for the far side of the lake, and that he had never asked questions again. Price's testimony had all the marks of truth. The shame in his manner, the way his hands trembled when he spoke of the sound he had heard, the fact that he had gone to the press, and then to the police, only after years of drinking had turned his conscience into a knife. He took investigators to a place on the Superior Shore where he said they'd hidden the cargo. Divers found nothing. The lake is a hungry thing, and 30 years consumes many secrets. But Alan's statement, combined with Marlene's and with Mercer's odd logbook entry, began to construct a case that prosecutors could try. What made the case especially charged was Hailey herself. She slowly regained pieces of memory in therapy. She would not give up names with the flippant grace of television dramas. Instead, she gave tiny shreds, a traffic sign with a nickname she remembered, a flavor of canned peaches saved in a town far from Duluth, an address with numbers she could only sketch. Those fragments, combined with Price's admission that the Turners had been taken ashore, begged a question that dug at both the legal and moral underpinnings of the community. Who else had been involved? Rumors, the kind that have the velocity of small towns, multiplied like seeds in wind. People began to look at neighbors with new curiosity. Old friendships frayed. The Turners' hangar, once a place of familiar laughter, became a site of tension. Mercer's business partners whispered about being blindsided. Old rivalries assumed the coloration of guilt by association. Families that had shared barbecue pits and Christmas wreaths found themselves standing on opposite sides of an argument that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with accountability. The prosecution, led by Assistant County Attorney Claire Jensen, had an uphill fight. Jensen was known for the talent of her preparation and the quiet ferocity of her cross-examinations. She took a dossier assembled from decades of drift and made it into something that could be presented in court as a story that reached the standard of proof. Jensen had to present a timeline, to show motive, to explain that a plane vanishing did not always equal an accident. She had to show that the pattern of Mercer's behavior, the late-night calls, the trips with coded statements, the possession of certain items, could not be dismissed as coincidence. The trial was an eruption in Duluth. The courtroom was packed every day. The press filled the hallways outside like vultures, not always merciless, but certainly relentless. Merchants taped notes in their windows. Pamphlets were passed in church foyers. The defense argued that Mercer was a man of good character framed by the desperation of a broken community. The defense painted Alan Price as unreliable, a man with a criminal record who had waited decades and perhaps had a desire to settle old scores. They painted Marlene as a woman scorned who could twist memory for effect. The defense lawyer, a man whose voice could swell thunder on television, asked the jury to consider how fragile a memory can be and how easy it is for truth to be replaced with rumor. But then, as often happens in criminal trials, the witnesses did what witnesses are supposed to do. They told what they knew. Marlene repeated her account, even as the defense tried to tear at her motives. Alan Price told the story again and again, each time softer, until the courtroom itself seemed to hold its breath. Hailey, for all her fragility, testified. Her voice broke in places that made people in the gallery flinch. She did not need to give explicit details to make the pain of loss palpable. She spoke about the moment she knew her family was gone, about the years of being moved like a parcel from a place to a place, about the simple human things, bedtime routines, lullabies, that had been stolen from her. She did not accuse with dramatic flourish. She answered the questions, and when asked whether she recognized Daniel Mercer, she looked at him and said, "Yes." The jury deliberated for days. In those days, Duluth felt split down the middle. Some residents believed in Mercer's guilt with the absolute faith of people who had mourned for 22 years. Others could not reconcile the man they had known with the charge of murder. On the 13th day, the jury returned a verdict, guilty. The courtroom released a gasping sound that was nearly audible. Mercer was taken into custody. At sentencing, the community gathered outside the courthouse with flowers and photos, and the small rituals of mourning turned closure. But the end of the trial did not feel like an end. The county had secured a conviction largely on witness testimony and the accumulation of circumstantial evidence. There was no clear wreck retrieved from the bottom of the lake. There was no singular indisputable piece of physical proof to tie Mercer's hand to the deaths of Mark, Lisa, and Emily Turner. What the prosecution had was a mosaic. Alibis that cracked, recollections that aligned, a motive of greed and jealousy that had been sketched from interviews, and the testimony of the person who had been lost and then found. After the trial, confessions began to ripple in unpredictable ways. Old acquaintances who had once been tight-lipped stepped forward to say they had once helped Mercer move things, or driven him to meetings, or had been paid in small, hush-money ways. Some confessions deepened the wound. A man admitted to having been on the boat the night the cargo had been taken out to sea. Another said he had seen a burial on a remote strip of shoreline. But confessions are slippery. Some were contradicted by other witnesses. Some could not be corroborated by physical evidence. And some seemed to be attempts to find absolution in the shadow of the prosecution's success. Prosecutors sifted each new statement carefully. Some became part of separate indictments. Some were dismissed as unreliable. Meanwhile, Hailey's life became a public river. The town that had watched her family disappear, watched her relearn how to be a person in private and in the light of cameras. Journalists followed her court appearances and wrote stories that split between triumphant and tragic. She gave interviews that were sometimes tender and sometimes jagged. She worked with therapists to piece together a sense of self that had been fractured by 2 decades of not knowing. People asked her to speak at memorials. She did, her voice steadying as she honored the lives of her parents and her sister. Her survival became both an answer and a new question. How do you live with a truth that has been extracted through pain? The case also exposed the fractures in a justice system that relies on both memory and physical proof. Some argued that justice was imperfect, that a man had been convicted without the smoking gun. Others argued that the hard work of decades of investigation and testimony had created a kind of justice that was real even without a complete body of physical evidence. The debate spilled into local papers and kitchen table conversations. A few people continued to whisper that Mercer had been framed, that justice had its blind spots. Others said the conviction had finally given the Turners a name to stick to the empty place in their lives. If the trial marked a kind of closure in one sense, it opened new doors in another. Detectives continued to pursue leads, a map of accomplices, a ledger of payments, a vessel whose ownership had been disguised by layers of shell companies. Price's confessions had implicated other men night workers at the docks, a contractor who had been paid to dispose of something. Whether those searches would net tangible results was unknown. The legal technicality that one conviction did not mean all wrongdoing had been uncovered became a live question. In court, Mercer maintained his innocence till the end, his eyes sometimes vacant, sometimes flaming with rage. His defense team promised appeals. Beyond the courtroom, the town of Duluth slowly inched toward a fragile peace. The Turner's house became a place people visited on anniversaries, leaving flowers or tidy stones with notes. The harbor where the search had once launched now often looked like any other. Fishermen casting at dusk, couples walking dogs along the pier. People who had shaken hands with Mercer at community events and who had felt the sickening churn of betrayal began to stitch their relationships back together. A small foundation in the Turner's name began offering support to families of missing persons, birthing its own rituals of remembrance in the community. But the story did not end with Mercer's conviction. There was one thing that none of the hearings could fully explain: Hailey's survival. She had disappeared as a child and yet had emerged 2 decades later with parts of her family's story intact. She had been moved from place to place. Yes, but for what reason? Financial gain? Some warped sense of control? If Mercer and his alleged collaborators had intended to kill the Turners and sink the plane, why keep a child alive? Several witnesses suggested mercenary reasons. Perhaps the child had been convenient to keep with the utility of silence bound by fear. Others imagined a more chilling calculus that left pieces on the floor of the lake. In private, Hailey worked to answer that question in ways the courthouse could not. She visited places she remembered or suspected, sometimes alone and sometimes with an investigator. She opened old trunks and read grocery lists, piecing together the lives they had left behind. She kept a notebook with a single rule: no graphic details, no delicious cruelty. She allowed herself only the facts that mattered to her own recovery. And then, on a fall evening, just after Mercer's sentencing, Hailey received a small, folded note left on her porch. There was no signature, only a line: "If you want to know where Emily is, go to the old lighthouse on the North Shore at sunrise." That note was an invitation to hope or to pain. It threatened to reopen everything, to breathe a new life into the case that everyone thought had found some measure of rest. Detectives convened in a hush. The lighthouse was a place of myth in Duluth lore. People walked there with coffee and cameras. At sunrise, a small team arrived with divers, lights, and the mechanical patience of people used to looking for answers in cold spaces. Hailey came as well, wrapped in a blanket that belonged to her mother. They searched the rocks and the tide pools, the old boathouse where a man might hide a truth he could not keep in daylight. The sea took everything and gave little. At the base of the lighthouse, they found nothing. A bottle lay broken, a seagull squawked, and the water was already shimmering. Yet someone had clearly left that note. For whom? Why? The question metastasized into a possibility that had the bitter tang of unfinished business. Perhaps there was someone else who had been keeping things away from the light, and now they were ready to speak. The cliffhanger, the thing that kept the town thinking and would keep viewers returning for another episode, was not a neat twist, but a raw human truth. Solving one question often leaves other questions in its wake. Mercer's conviction had answered the most pressing who in the case, but it had not plumbed every reason, every mechanism, every secret. There were still names that had not been spoken in open court, bank accounts with marginal notations, a boat whose log vanished into the mouths of men who remembered differently. There was a map of complicity that was still only half drawn. Hailey's life too, would not be wrapped in tidy endings. She would have to face public curiosity forever. And there would be nights when memories, jagged, unnamed things, would come back like cold rain through a window. But there would also be mornings when the sun felt like a permission slip to walk, to work, to speak. She began to record her memory fragments in a voice that was not an outcry, but a catalog, a careful inventory of the life that had been taken and the life that had returned. She said once to Detective Ortiz in the quiet of a long hallway, "I want to know why. Not for revenge. For them. For Emily. For Mom and Dad." Ortiz, who had spent his life listening to people ask for what could not be granted, nodded and said, "We'll find it." It is a humble promise, and there are no guarantees. The lake keeps its own account, and sometimes the only justice a town gets is the slow truth of who was responsible. Yet the Minnesota 1992 cold case solved. The phrase that would be typed into search bars and set into microphones mattered because it was not simply about a legal victory. It was about the people who refused to let a family be reduced to a footnote. It was about the small actions that stitch a case together. A former girlfriend's quiet conscience, a mechanic's late-night guilt, a daughter's return that broke the long, dry spell of grief into something that could be worked with. As for the lighthouse note, the detectives filed it away as evidence, and then they waited. People wondered whether the note was a cruel joke, an attempt to reopen a wound, or a genuine breadcrumb. And there, the edge of the story, is the reason the cameras stayed on. Because even when courts pronounce the end, human lives ask for more. They demand truth. And sometimes a truth reveals that the map of culpability is broader than anyone believed. The story closes on a small image. Hailey sitting on the Turner's back porch as the sun dips behind the lake, holding a mason jar of peaches, a flavor she remembered from childhood and had finally learned to name again. She keeps the jar on the porch where the family used to eat. She runs her fingers along the glass and whispers the names of her family, one by one, as if calling them back into being. There's no final scene of perfect closure. Instead, there's a long, honest sequence of work. Interviews, searches, appeals, more whispers, a possibility of more arrests, a town that will never be the same but will survive. The last line is not an ending, but an invitation to watch, to remember, and to come back when the next chapter opens. They said the lake had taken what it wanted and kept its account. They were wrong. After the lighthouse note, the case that had felt like a finished book reopened like a wound. The county cold case unit, buoyed by Mercer's conviction and by the fresh oxygen of confessions, pushed beyond the mosaic they had assembled during the trial. They were no longer content to accept a story that explained enough. They wanted the whole architecture. Detective Sam Ortiz, who had watched Hailey fold years of absence into a single fragile life, found himself hauling a box of court transcripts across a table at dawn. He had thought Mercer was the end of it. He had thought conviction might close a cabinet of questions. Instead, the note had the precise violence of a small, undeniable fact. Someone or someone's wanted people looking at the North Shore. Someone wanted attention focused there. Someone wanted to be found or to be watched. It suggested intentionality, a breadcrumb sown by either conscience or provocation. Hailey insisted she had not written the note and that she could not fathom who would. She had been steady in public, but private nights were a different thing. Her sleep was a tight, thorny seam. She agreed to go back to the places she had dim recollections of: hired rooms, the shores of little harbors, a handful of addresses whose numbers she could only trace by fits. She walked into rooms with a pocket of detectives and looked at furniture and wallpaper as if they might cough up a memory. Sometimes she would stand very still and let the air around her settle into an image, a bowl, a scent, a child's toy. And then, painfully, there would be nothing. Memory, she had learned, was an erratic house guest. The first new lead came from an old ledger discovered by the county auditor during a routine search of Mercer's financials. Mercer had served as a convenient middleman for transactions that, on paper, belonged to others. Tucked into a notebook among invoices and flight plans were entries in a looping hand. Payments, amounts, dates. The names attached to many of the accounts were shell companies, not unusual in local commerce. But one name stood out: North Shore Holdings, a development company headed by a man named Harold Greaves. Greaves was a cinder block of Midwestern success, a donor to the hospital, a speaker at the Chamber of Commerce, a man whose name sat engraved on the wing of the airport he claimed to deeply love. He owned property along the lake and had tried for years to expand a marina and a series of luxury cottages that would, in his vision, turn a fisherman's harbor into a destination. He had pursued the Turner stretch of shoreline before they vanished. Ortiz felt the hairs at his neck stand up as he read the ledger. The amounts were small enough to be explained away as consulting fees, and too regular to be merely casual gifts. More important, a name that had not appeared in the earlier investigation, a captain named Orrin Hale, kept recurring as a recipient for discreet cash withdrawals around the time of the Turners' disappearance. Orrin Hale had been a local boat operator who, according to old municipal papers, had once been hired to move equipment out into the lake. He had died in the years since the Turners vanished, a quiet man at a quiet funeral. He could not be interrogated now, but bank records did not require breath to be meaningful. Ortiz took a folder to Assistant County Attorney Claire Jensen and laid it on her desk like a prayer. Jensen, whose cross-examinations had once felt a powerful man in court, read the ledger with the same unhurried focus she applied to evidence. "This could explain motive," she said finally. "It could explain access. But it's still circumstantial until we get someone to put a voice to it." The next piece came quicker than anyone expected. A woman who had worked as Greaves' bookkeeper decades earlier called the DA's office anonymously and then agreed to meet in a lonesome coffee shop on the edge of town. She spoke with the curious reserve of someone who had been carrying a secret for years. Her name was Darlene Marks. She had fingers that trembled when she stirred sugar into her coffee. But her eyes were clear. "Harold paid for things he wanted quick and clean," Darlene said. "In '92, he wanted the Turner's shoreline. They said no. He didn't like no." She produced a folder and handed it to Jensen. It contained memos, invoices, copies of checks written from North Shore Holdings to accounts that matched entries in Mercer's ledger. Darlene had been cleaning out a safe deposit box after an illness and found the copies. She had kept them because she had once sworn she would. "I thought if I kept them, maybe it would sort itself out," she said. Which is to say, she had trusted time to solve what she had been too afraid to expose. Now the net tightened. Greaves, when spoken to, was polished and inscrutable. He answered with the same practiced concern he had always shown for community affairs. He admitted he had tried to buy the Turners' land, and he admitted he had paid Mercer for consulting, because Mercer had, in the past, flown over prospective development sites for him. But Greaves' demeanor when he described the Turners, his voice warm, his hands measured, was not the voice of a man who sent people into the lake. He pledged cooperation. He offered open books. He was photographed at a ribbon cutting, arm in arm with city leaders, a man for whom public perception was a currency. Still, evidence stacked behind him like winter clouds. Creaky bank transfers, a ledger entry for a boat repair at a marina where Orrin Hale had moored, and a witness who came forward. This one, not new to the case but newly vocal, who swore they had seen Harold Greaves at the docks after the Turners vanished. The witness, retired dockhand named Tommy Lee, had been drinking then and reticent now. His voice was small. "I seen him," he said. I don't know why I didn't say nothing. Sometimes fear makes you shut your mouth. Tommy's sighting was corroborated by an old gas receipt with a Greaves name punched onto it. It was not a smoking gun, but in the dance of prosecution, it was a dance partner. Investigators executed a search warrant on a property Greaves owned at the far side of the harbor, a property that had been renovated into guest quarters and storage for his supposed development. They expected to find invoices, maybe old papers. What they found instead was a sealed room behind a false wall in a boathouse, a tidy, adult-sized suite with a cot, a small closet, and a trunk with a child-sized blanket folded neatly inside. There was no sign of a body, no dried blood, no manifest horror. The room bore the patient impersonality of a place designed to keep someone alive and invisible. Inside the trunk, beneath a layer of dust, were items that were small and enormous at once. A prayer book cornered with childish scrawl and folded into a shirt pocket, a faded photograph of the Turner family, Mark smiling at the camera, Lisa with her arm around Emily. The same photograph that had once sat on a mantel in Duluth. Hailey did not need to be told. Her throat closed when she saw it. The photograph had been tucked into a place meant to be found for reasons investigators could not yet explain. A breadcrumb of guilt, perhaps, or a provocation. Greaves called his lawyer and said through his teeth that this was a frame, a setup by people who resented his success. He agreed to cooperate with the condition of privacy and legal counsel at every step. Ortiz and Jensen pressed on. The boathouse suite was evidence of concealment and of an intention not merely to end a life, but to control it. It suggested the Turner family had not simply been victims of a single crime. They had been part of a plan that required places to hold and move them, and people to pay for such labor. In court, the narrative thickened. Prosecution painted Greaves as the architect, a man who used influence and money to secure what he wanted and to silence those who opposed him. The defense responded with the reflex of the wealthy, innuendo as character attack. They questioned Darlene's motives, blamed time for Tommy's memory lapses, and insisted that finding a trunk with a photograph did not equate to orchestrating murder. But such defenses ignore the weight of accumulation. The court heard from a man who had never been willing to speak before, a mariner who had sworn that in 1992 he had ferried cargo at night and seen heavy items loaded into a vessel that had sailed under the cover of fog. The mariner, Mr. Bennett, had been paid in envelopes he needed to survive. I was small then, he said. I thought I had choices. I had no choices that were good. He described seeing a child-sized blanket among the bundles and hearing, for the first time in his life, the sound of someone crying in a way that was not loud but final. It was a powerful testimony, not because it was cinematic, but because it felt like human confession. It fit with Price's earlier story and with the boathouse discovery. In the face of this, the defense's insistence on reasonable doubt became a thinner thing. The case against Greaves extended beyond motive to method. He had the means to orchestrate removals, to pay for discretion, and to broker silence in a small town where work connected people and fear kept contracts intact. The courtroom drama gripped Duluth the way a seasonal storm grips a shoreline. The town divided not along tidy lines, but along small local fault lines. Those who had benefited from Greaves' projects found themselves defending the man, some out of loyalty and some out of personal gratitude. Those who had once been offered money to sell property and refused watched with a renewed certainty of having been right. Congregations argued in parking lots. Children who had once waved to Greaves' convoy now had to reconcile their memories of generosity with the idea of complicity. Then, in an operation cooler in planning than anything the county had performed before, detectives and federal agents coordinated raids on multiple properties linked to Greaves. The operation was surgical. Dawn muted engines. Warrants executed with the professionalism of people who had watched a map for days. They found ledger entries in safes, envelopes with names, and in a small, secluded cottage on a private inlet connected to Greaves by a chain of mortgages. The thing no one expected. Emily, she was not the child the town had mourned. She was a woman now, with a face that carried both the softness of innocence and the hard ridge of someone who had learned to survive. She was alive, and the discovery of her was not cinematic. It was organized, quiet, and bureaucratic. She sat on a sagging couch with a blanket over her knees and looked at the people around her with an appraisal that felt both immediate and suspicious. Hailey, when they brought her to the cottage, walked toward Emily like someone approaching a fire, with care and a hunger both. Their reunion was not the neat, triumphant moment broadcast on television in other cases. It was smaller and more complicated. Two survivors trying to recognize a life they had never been given the chance to grow into. They hugged like people who knew the shape of each other's bones. They cried in ways that were startlingly private, and they laughed, a single soft sound that did not erase pain, but made it breathe. The town was stunned. Emily's emergence shattered the last stubborn belief many held, that the lake had been the final editor. For those who loved the Turners, it was an unfurling of grief and relief at the same time. For the prosecution, finding Emily meant the case was no longer entirely circumstantial. There was now a living witness whose presence in a property tied to Greaves formed a bridge across many previously separate fragments of evidence. Emily's testimony in the trial that followed was careful and harrowing in its methodical restraint. She spoke about being moved from place to place, about how adults who were not her parents told her stories with soft, persuasive voices and helped to keep her compliant with gifts and promises. She did not offer lurid or explicit details. She gave the court the facts she could bear, where she had been, the names she had heard, the ways she had been convinced to be quiet. She described the night when she and Hailey had been taken somewhere that smelled of varnish and salt and told that this was to be their new life. She used the words "we were told," and "we were kept," and "we were given," phrases that suggest coercion without descending into graphic descriptions. The jury listened like people who had been waiting to hold these stories in their hands. Greaves threatened to be the most consequential trial Duluth had seen in a generation. He had been a man who decided over dinner that certain families needed to be moved for the good of a plan. His motive was not in any romantic sense a crime of passion. It was a ledger crime, a transaction with human currency. He had been careful about his fingerprints. He had never once been caught on a security tape hauling package. But the human trail, the bookkeeper's copies, the boat receipts, the mariner's confession, the boathouse room, Price's memory, Bennett's testimony, and Emily's presence formed a raft that could carry a conviction. At trial, Greaves' defense tried to peel the case apart like layers of old paint. They told the jury to doubt the memory of men who had been drinking, to wonder if the boathouse room might have been staged, to see the ledger as regular business. They argued that the wealthy are easy targets for accusations because their public persona supplies a delicious hypocrisy to those who have been wronged. Greaves, on the stand, looked smaller than in photographs. He insisted, with the manner of someone telling a practiced lie, that he had never asked Mercer to do harm. He said he had never slept poorly about the Turners, the implication being that if he had, surely it would be stated by his conscience. The defense's best weapon was plausibility. the possibility that a web of misinterpreted evidence could be made to look like a net. But plausibility collapses against weight when a jury chooses to believe the accounts of measurable human loss. Greaves was found guilty on multiple counts: conspiracy to commit kidnapping and conspiracy to commit murder. The verdict stunned the community, not because the outcome was surprising, but because a man who had donated to the hospital and chaired civic committees stood convicted of trading human lives for property. The sentencing day was quiet in a way that surprised everyone. There was no mob. There were only people who had been changed by knowledge. Families who years ago had felt impotent found themselves with a name to attach to anger. Hailey and Emily sat together in the gallery. Two women who had traveled through a decades-long dark and now shared a seat in daylight. Greaves' face was a study in containment. But closure, the prosecutors kept learning, is rarely a tidy parcel. 3 weeks after the sentencing, a junior investigator, idly cleaning out a cardboard box of evidence in a process called discovery compliance, found something that had been missed: a notebook, Jeremiah's ledger, a narrow-bound thing that had been misfiled among receipts. It had not been found in the initial raids because it had been cleverly separated and left in a place meant to survive searches: the glove compartment of an old pickup truck Greaves claimed as a relic. The notebook was banal at first glance: lists of maintenance jobs, notes on contractors, grocery items. But in the back, in a hand that matched entries in the earlier ledger, were names, not random names, lists of addresses with dates. Some dates lined up with past disappearances. There were other towns listed too, in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. Names of properties acquired in strange sequences and a string of dates that suggested pattern. It read like a planner of logistics. At the bottom of one page, a list of 5 surnames was followed by a phrase in Greaves' handwriting: clear for development. Proceed when possible. This time the town's stomach turned. Greaves' conviction felt both vindicated and grotesquely small. The ledger suggested what prosecutors had feared in the quietest hours: that the Turner family might be only the most terrible example of a pattern. The notebook was evidence not of a single sin, but of a system, a ledger of removal and replacement designed to make land liquid and loved ones disappear into the busy work of commerce. Investigators followed the names and found clusters of purchases and shell transactions. They interviewed people who had been paid for services as recently as the late 90s. And then, in a move that seared the entire region, they executed warrants in 2 other states and found more boathouse rooms, carefully constructed and provisioned. No bodies were discovered. Not every ledger entry led to a confirmed kidnapping, but enough of them did to alter the map of trust. The revelation spread like a chemical through the social fabric of Duluth. Families that had sold land for development years ago started to look at old deeds with a new eye. Churches held meetings to make sense of their role in shaping community priorities. Politicians who had accepted donations from Greaves felt the cold light of scrutiny. Philanthropic foundations returned plaques. The town felt diminished not only by what had been lost, but by how little anyone had suspected the potential for profit to become monstrous. Then, on a late autumn night when the water outside the harbor was a breathed-out black, Hailey received an envelope with no return address. Inside, folded 3 times, was a single sheet of paper and a line in a hand she recognized, not because she had seen it publicly, but because, in the safe closet of her memory, certain things have the weight of their handwriting. The line read, 2 more. North Shore Ledger, page 42. Her breath left her like a small animal startled. Page 42. She had seen the ledger. She had seen the head of Greaves' handwriting in a thick black pen. Page 42 had been overlooked in initial transcription because an intern had marked the number wrong. Hailey called Ortiz with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else. They went to the stack of evidence with knives for patience and found, indeed, a half-finished entry on page 42, names and dates, and then a margin note that read, "Not yet. Hold until market warms." It suggested not only that more plans had been hatched, but that plans were sometimes delayed and sometimes executed. The margin note was a message that human greed tends to write as if it were only business, and that cruelty, when disguised as commerce, can look like paperwork. The presence of a ledger meant the case had changed from a single murder to an indictment on a pattern of depravity. Officials issued subpoenas and alerts. The town prepared for revelations. There were hearings, more testimony, and the quiet recounting of how good intentions can be tubed into something else. Then, in the middle of a press conference meant to reassure the public, the final blow arrived not as a whisper, but as a visual. A local paper printed a photograph that had surfaced in the social media swell, a small, unnoticed photo from a family album that someone had scanned and posted for reasons of nostalgia. It showed a midsummer picnic on the Turner's lawn. In the background, nearly invisible, but there was a familiar face, a man who had handed out community grants and smiled from the backs of civic photos, Harold Greaves, standing at the edge of the frame like a fly on varnish. He looked ordinary, and ordinary-looking is the most untrustworthy thing of all. Beneath the picture, someone had circled the name of the man standing next to Greaves. It was Detective Sam Ortiz. The image rippled through the town like a fledge. Someone had dug up a photograph from the festival when Ortiz had, years before, been a young patrolman. He had stood with his arm around Greaves in a brief moment of celebration. The town's eyes shifted. Ortiz felt the immediate chill of suspicion. The paper demanded answers, and Ortiz had none that mattered to reporters. He stood in his office, palms pressed to the sill, and watched the rain smear the streetlights into long, sad rectangles. People who had never doubted him started to ask whether trust could be reevaluated. Ortiz's phone did not ring with praise. It rang with inquiries. Old colleagues asked if he had any meetings scheduled with Greaves in the past. Ortiz thought of every decision he had made in the case and how small those choices had seemed at the time. He thought of how he had been friends with Greaves for a decade, about charity lunches and his own acceptance of a business card. He thought of the looks of gratitude from town leaders when he had moved the Turner's file forward. He felt, for the first time in his career, the hot basin of being publicly inspected. An investigator from the State Division called him in for an interview. Ortiz sat across from the interviewer and swore that he had never taken a bribe, never altered an evidence list, never protected Greaves. He was cleared on the spot of any legal tie to the ledger. But the clearing was not a wash of innocence. It was simply a legal note appended to a human story. The court of public opinion is not interested in legal exoneration alone. People wanted to know how a man who represented the community for years could have stood close enough to the architect of a scheme to be photographed with him. Ortiz understood that photographs are proof of proximity, but not of complicity. He also understood that proximity is its own kind of moral peril. The story's final and most chilling turn came not from a courtroom or a ledger, but from a locked safe in Greaves' estate. After his conviction, someone had gone through the old safe and pulled out an object wrapped in a yellowed towel, a small wooden box, the kind people use to hold keepsakes. Inside, like a punctuation mark, were matchbooks from establishments across the region, a map of the places men who move things might meet at night. Alongside them, folded tight and brittle, was a list of names. Not all the names were unknown. Several belonged to people the town had heard of only in passing. A family in a neighboring county who had sold land, a small marina owner who had gone bankrupt in the late 90s. But at the very end of the list, in a crabbed, hurried hand, was a date that had not yet come. June 17th, 2026. A silence fell over the room where the detectives crowded. The date was, in its neatness, a threat. It meant the ledger was not simply a relic. It was an unfinished plan. Some things become evidence only when they are acted on. The presence of a date meant there were future victims planned. Whether June 17th would be a date of sale, of removal, of some transaction the ledger makers used for cruelty did not matter. The map was not exclusively backward-looking. It had a needle pointing forward. Hailey read the date and felt, quite simply, the world tilt. She had fought to bring truth to light, to summon the names that had been hidden behind receipted envelopes and polite smiles. Now the truth pointed to an unfinished business, one that allowed new possibilities of harm. She thought of Emily, of the boat that had taken them away, of the months and years of slow recovery, and realized that revelation had a cost. The community would not be allowed to sleep. Greaves' story closed. His cell door clanged and the county could mark a conviction. But the ledger's last line meant Duluth would watch the calendar. Civic leaders would call emergency meetings. Banks would be subpoenaed. Families who had sold land would be visited by detectives working through obscure paper trails. The town would learn how much business practice and human cruelty can mirror each other in their clinical exactness. The final scene is not the courtroom, nor the jail, nor the reunion. It is a quiet image that is private and public at once. On a summer night, Hailey sits on the Turner's porch with Emily beside her. They look out at the water, the same lake that had once swallowed an aircraft without returning it. In a pocket of Hailey's coat is the brittle yellowed piece of paper from Greaves' safe, the list and the date. She turns it over in her fingers and watches the last light of day shrink into the lake's ink. "You think it'll stop?" Emily asks, small and steady, older now in ways no childhood should have taught a person to be. Hailey cannot answer with certainty. She knows the justice system can punish a man and still leave the ledger unclosed. She knows that greed can survive convictions. She knows that time and wind will wash some things away and that other things will cling like barnacles. But she also knows more deeply that the town will not unsee what it has seen. She folds a paper and slides it into an envelope. Outside, a dog barks in the distance and a fishing light glows like a single eye on the water. The camera remembering that this is, as promised, a documentary-style telling for an audience who will search for closure. Lingers on the porch light. The mason jar of peaches with its lid slightly askew. And on the way the two women sit close enough that their shoulders touch without the need for words. Then, in the final moments that close this chapter and throw a new one open, the scene cuts not to a resolution, but to an image that leaves the viewer's chest clenched. A close-up of the envelope as Hailey seals it, and a slow pan to the calendar on the kitchen wall across the room. It is marked with small, neat pencil notes, birthdays, appointments, and in a hand she cannot remember ever making. Someone has circled June 17th, 2026. The camera holds on the circled date until the screen goes black. It is a closing that is not an ending. It promises that the town will watch the calendar and that the ledger and what it signified will not be allowed to rest quietly in a safe again. It leaves a town stunned and a nation leaning forward. A conviction can close one door, but some doors hide hinges that no verdict can fully examine. The last image is a simple one, a date circled, and it conjures a cold, patient certainty that the story is not over. Before you go, make sure to hit subscribe and share, tap like, and turn on notifications. That way you'll never miss the next mystery solved cold case videos. We truly appreciate your support. Thanks for listening and watching.